The moment the trees disappeared, Diane got the view she wanted. What she did not realize was that she had just given me a reason to build something 120 feet tall. I knew something was wrong before I even stepped outside. The silence woke me up. For nearly 15 years, every morning on my property started the same way. The wind moved through 80 mature walnut trees that lined the northern edge of my land. Their branches created a soft, rustling sound that blended with birdsong and the distant hum of rural life. It was the soundtrack of home. But that morning, there was nothing. No rustling leaves. No shifting branches. Just an open stillness that felt unnatural. I sat up, looked at the clock beside my bed, and noticed the pale orange glow of sunrise pushing through the curtains. Then I grabbed my boots and headed toward the back porch. The moment I opened the door, my stomach dropped. The horizon looked wrong. The entire northern boundary of my property was exposed. 80 walnut trees that had stood there for decades were gone. Every single one. Cold morning air rushed across open ground where a natural wall of green had existed the day before. The smell of fresh cut wood lingered in the air. Long rows of stumps stretched across the property line like scars. I stood there frozen, staring at the empty space. My name is Ethan Mercer. I own a large piece of agricultural land on the edge of a growing residential community. Long before the subdivision existed, long before the HOA arrived with its rules and committees, those walnut trees were already part of the landscape. They protected crops from heavy winds. They provided privacy. They reduced soil erosion. They even generated income through periodic walnut harvests. To me, they were not decorations. They were infrastructure, living infrastructure. I walked toward the property line as the rising sun poured across the open field. Without the trees, the entire neighborhood behind them was visible. Rows of identical homes stretched across the hillside. I already knew who was responsible before I saw the tire tracks. Diane Whitaker, HOA president. The woman who had spent the last year insisting the trees created what she called a visual obstruction. According to her, residents deserved better sightlines, better views, better aesthetics. I had heard those arguments so many times that I could practically recite them myself. What Diane never seemed to understand was that my property was not part of her neighborhood. My land existed independently of the HOA. The trees belonged to me. The maintenance belonged to me. The taxes belonged to me. Yet somehow she always acted as though she had authority over everything she could see from her clubhouse window. As I examined the fresh stumps, I noticed survey markers near several sections of the boundary. Bright orange stakes protruded from the ground. That detail immediately caught my attention, because I knew exactly what those markers meant. Someone had recently been measuring. Someone had been studying property lines. Someone had been preparing for something. The strange thing was that instead of feeling angry, I felt curious. The open horizon revealed something I had not been able to fully see before. The wind. Strong, steady currents moved uninterrupted across the cleared corridor. I watched tall grass bend in long, synchronized waves across the field. For the first time, an idea entered my mind. An idea connected to a report sitting inside my office. A report I had ordered months earlier for an entirely different project. Standing there among 80 freshly cut stumps, I realized Diane had spent months fighting to create this view. She was proud of what she had accomplished. And if I was right about what those survey markers meant, she was about to regret it every single day. Those trees had not appeared overnight. They represented decades of growth, patience, and planning. As I walked along the property line that morning, stepping over fresh wood chips and scattered branches left behind after the clearing operation, memories kept surfacing. I remembered planting replacement saplings with my father after a storm damaged part of the row when I was a teenager. I remembered long summer afternoons gathering walnuts beneath the shade while hot winds swept across neighboring fields. I remembered watching hawks nest in the upper branches and deer move through the narrow corridors between the trunks during early autumn mornings. The walnut line was more than scenery. It was part of the farm's operating system. It slowed wind before it reached sensitive crop sections. It reduced moisture loss during dry seasons. It created a natural barrier between agricultural activity and the residential development that eventually appeared beyond the ridge. Most people saw trees. I saw infrastructure. By mid-morning, several neighboring farmers had already called. News traveled fast in rural communities. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why had the trees been removed? I wish I had a simple answer. The truth was that the conflict had been building for nearly a year. Diane Whitaker had become increasingly vocal about what she called visual improvement initiatives. During HOA meetings, she frequently discussed enhancing sightlines throughout the neighborhood. Residents, she argued, should be able to enjoy broader views of the countryside. On the surface, that sounded harmless. Who could object to better views? The problem was that her definition of improvement always seemed to involve someone else's property. The first complaints focused on the density of the Walnut line. Then came discussions about shadows. After that came concerns about aesthetics. Every few months, a new justification appeared. I attended several meetings out of curiosity. Sitting quietly in the back of the room, I listened as presentation slides showed aerial images of the area. The Walnut corridor appeared repeatedly. Diane would point toward it with a laser pointer while discussing future community enhancements. Residents nodded along without understanding what those trees actually did. To them, the line looked like a green wall. To me, it was the result of decades of land management decisions. Standing beside one of the larger stumps that afternoon, I counted growth rings exposed on the freshly cut surface. There were more than 40. Some of the older trees were likely older than many homeowners living behind them. The realization only strengthened my resolve to understand exactly what had happened. As the sun climbed higher, strong gusts continued sweeping across the newly exposed corridor. The open space acted almost like a funnel. Grass bent sharply. Dust lifted from sections of bare soil. Even the sound was different. Wind now moved freely across the property with a low, steady whistle I had never heard before. That was when I remembered the report. Months earlier, I had commissioned a renewable energy assessment while exploring long-term improvements for the farm. At the time, it was merely a curiosity. Now it felt strangely relevant. Back inside my office, I opened a drawer and pulled out the thick binder. Wind measurements, site evaluations, topographic studies. As I flipped through the pages, one highlighted section immediately caught my attention. The strongest and most consistent wind resource on the entire property existed along the exact boundary where 80 walnut trees had once stood. The report changed everything because it transformed frustration into strategy. I spent the next several evenings sitting in my office reviewing every page while spring winds rattled the windows. Outside, the newly exposed boundary continued channeling powerful gusts across the property. Without the Walnut corridor acting as a windbreak, airflow moved through the area with remarkable consistency. According to the assessment, the location already possessed favorable wind characteristics before the trees were removed. Now the numbers looked even stronger. But before I got ahead of myself, I needed answers. Specifically, I needed to know how 80 mature trees had disappeared. The following week became a crash course in paperwork. I pulled property records, reviewed survey maps, examined easement documents, and contacted county offices. Every conversation led to another document. Every document led to another question. What I discovered was both frustrating and fascinating. Diane had spent months building support for what she called a visibility improvement project. The language sounded harmless in meeting minutes. Phrases like view enhancement and community beautification appeared repeatedly. Yet when I compared those discussions against actual property boundaries, a major problem emerged. The HOA did not control the land where the walnut trees had stood. The trees existed entirely on private agricultural property. My property. That realization should have been the end of the matter. Instead, it became the beginning. One evening, I attended another HOA meeting. The clubhouse overlooked rolling hills that glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Residents filled most of the seats. Diane stood confidently at the front of the room, discussing recent accomplishments. During a presentation slide showcasing improved sightlines, photographs of the cleared corridor appeared on the screen. Several residents applauded. Others simply nodded. Diane smiled as though she had completed a successful community project. Sitting quietly in the back row, I watched the images. The irony was impossible to ignore. The wider view she celebrated also revealed something else. The long, uninterrupted stretch of open land created by removing the trees. A corridor with excellent exposure to prevailing winds. A corridor that happened to align almost perfectly with the recommendations inside my wind assessment report. As the meeting ended, several residents approached me. Some offered sympathy regarding the trees. Others admitted they had not realized the walnut line belonged entirely to my property. A few even expressed concern about how everything unfolded. Their reactions reinforced an important lesson. Most homeowners had never wanted a conflict. They simply followed information presented to them. Diane, meanwhile, seemed increasingly confident. She believed the issue was finished. The trees were gone. The view was open. The story was over. Back at the farm later that night, I spread several documents across my kitchen table. Wind assessment reports sat beside zoning maps. County regulations rested next to utility interconnection guidelines. For hours, I compared notes and highlighted sections. Then I found something that made me stop completely. Local regulations allowed agricultural property owners to install renewable energy infrastructure under specific conditions. Height restrictions differed from residential standards. Setback requirements were manageable. Utility connections were permitted. I read the section 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Then I checked again. Outside, a steady wind moved across the newly opened boundary, rattling a loose gate near the equipment shed. The sound carried through the darkness like a reminder. Diane had spent a year trying to create a better view. What she had actually created was the perfect location for something far larger than any tree that had ever stood there. The next month was spent doing something Diane never expected. I stopped talking and started measuring. Every morning began before sunrise with a notebook, a thermos of coffee, and hours of fieldwork along the cleared boundary. While the neighborhood admired its newly opened view, I was documenting wind patterns. Small monitoring equipment appeared across sections of the property. Temporary survey flags marked locations. Weather instruments collected data day and night. Most residents had no idea what they were looking at. They assumed it was related to farming operations. I encouraged that assumption. The less attention the project received, the better. What fascinated me was how dramatically the landscape had changed after the Walnut corridor disappeared. Wind that once slowed and dispersed through 80 mature trees now traveled across the open ground uninterrupted. Certain areas experienced remarkably consistent airflow. The numbers coming back from the monitoring equipment confirmed what the original assessment suggested. The location possessed genuine renewable energy potential. Not theoretical potential, measurable potential. By late spring, I had assembled enough information to contact an engineering firm specializing in agricultural energy systems. A team arrived one bright morning and spent several hours walking the property with me. We examined terrain elevations, utility access points, setback distances, and prevailing wind directions. The lead engineer studied maps spread across the hood of a truck while gusts tugged at the corners of the documents. Eventually, he looked toward the cleared boundary and smiled. According to him, the site was unusually strong for a private installation. Hearing those words felt surreal. Only a few months earlier, I had been standing among freshly cut stumps trying to process what had happened. Now I was discussing infrastructure projects. The contrast was remarkable. Meanwhile, Diane remained focused on celebrating what she viewed as a successful campaign. HOA newsletters featured photographs of improved views. Community updates highlighted expanded sightlines. Residents were encouraged to enjoy the newly visible countryside. Every time I saw one of those newsletters, I found myself shaking my head. The irony continued growing larger. Because every photograph proudly displaying the open horizon also showcased the exact corridor engineers considered ideal. By early summer, the planning phase intensified. County zoning offices received inquiries. Permit requirements were reviewed. Utility interconnection procedures were examined. I approached every step carefully because I knew one mistake could create delays. The project needed to be completely compliant. Every form, every survey, every inspection, every requirement. Weeks passed. Documents accumulated. Meetings filled my calendar. The process was not exciting from the outside. There were no dramatic confrontations. No heated arguments. Just stacks of paperwork and countless hours spent understanding regulations. That was exactly why it worked. One afternoon, while reviewing setback calculations with a county planner, I received confirmation that changed the entire trajectory of the project. Based on agricultural zoning standards and the specific dimensions of the property, a structure significantly taller than any remaining object in the area could be legally permitted. I thanked the planner, hung up the phone, and sat quietly for several minutes. Outside my office window, wind moved steadily across the open corridor where 80 walnut trees once stood. The realization slowly settled in. Diane had spent a year fighting for visibility. Now the same regulations she never bothered to examine were pointing towards something far more visible than she could have imagined. The permits were not approved yet. The engineering work was not finished. But for the first time, I could clearly see the future. And it was rising 120 feet into the sky. The approval process moved slower than most people imagine. Movies make large projects look dramatic. Real life looks like conference calls, engineering diagrams, environmental reviews, and stacks of forms thick enough to fill entire shelves. That summer, my office became command central. Survey maps covered the walls. Wind studies occupied every available desk. Permit applications sat in organized folders arranged by agency, department, and review stage. Every document represented another step forward. Every signature brought the project closer to reality. What kept me motivated was the simple fact that everything was being done correctly. There were no shortcuts, no loopholes, no special favors, just regulations being followed exactly as written. Meanwhile, life inside the neighborhood continued as usual. Diane remained convinced the visibility project had been a success. Community newsletters still featured photographs of the expanded views. Residents continued enjoying sunsets that had once been partially filtered through 80 walnut trees. Some even commented that the area felt more open and modern. I found those comments interesting because they revealed how differently people viewed land. Many homeowners saw scenery. Farmers saw function. Engineers saw systems. And increasingly, I saw opportunity. One afternoon, several representatives from the energy company visited the property. We spent hours walking the cleared corridor while discussing foundation requirements, utility connections, and construction logistics. The wind never stopped. Gust after gust moved steadily across the open ground. At one point, one of the engineers laughed and said the site practically introduced itself. Hearing that made me think about the walnut trees again. For decades, they had softened those winds and protected the land behind them. Their absence had completely changed the character of the property. Later that week, I received preliminary design renderings. The structure looked impressive even on paper. Clean lines, modern engineering, efficient design. Most importantly, it fit entirely within county regulations. I studied the diagrams late into the evening. The projected height was impossible to ignore. 120 feet. Taller than any tree that had ever stood along the boundary. Taller than anything visible from the surrounding neighborhood. Taller than Diane could possibly imagine. Yet despite that reality, she still had no idea what was coming. The first hint appeared when survey crews returned to the property. Residents began noticing equipment. Bright markers appeared across portions of the field. Temporary measurement stations stood near the boundary. Questions started circulating through the neighborhood. Some people assumed I was expanding agricultural operations. Others guessed I might be building a storage facility. Rumors spread quickly, but nobody seemed close to the truth. That changed on a windy Friday afternoon when an official county notice was posted as part of the permitting process. The document outlined a proposed renewable energy installation. Within hours, phones started ringing. Emails started arriving. Curiosity spread throughout the community. For the first time since the trees disappeared, Diane began asking questions. Standing on my porch that evening, watching the sun sink behind the hills, I noticed powerful gusts moving across the corridor once again. Grass bent in long rolling waves exactly where the walnut line had stood. The same wind Diane unknowingly unleashed months earlier was now helping drive the project forward. And as darkness settled across the property, I realized something important. The permits were advancing. The engineering was complete. The paperwork was nearly finished. Soon the conversation would stop being about possibilities. Soon everyone would be looking at construction schedules. The first construction schedule arrived on a Monday morning. I remember staring at the email while sunlight poured through my office window and a steady breeze rattled the loose branches that remained near the boundary. After months of surveys, engineering reviews, permit applications, and technical meetings, the project had finally crossed into reality. Equipment deliveries were scheduled. Foundation work was approved. Utility coordination had been completed. The turbine was no longer an idea sitting inside a binder. It was becoming a physical structure. The reaction from the neighborhood was immediate. By then, most residents had heard rumors. Some believed I was installing agricultural equipment. Others thought I was constructing a communications tower. A few assumed the project would never receive final approval. Then the official county documents became publicly accessible, and speculation turned into certainty. One afternoon, I noticed several homeowners standing near the edge of their subdivision looking toward my property. They pointed at survey markers and discussed the construction plans. The open corridor that Diane had fought so hard to create now served as a perfect visual pathway for everyone to watch what was happening. The irony was impossible to ignore. A week later, the first trucks arrived. They were not carrying turbine components yet. Instead, they brought equipment needed to prepare the site. Survey crews returned. Engineers walked the property. Utility representatives inspected connection points. Bright safety markers appeared across the field. Every day the project became slightly more visible. Every day more residents started asking questions. Diane finally contacted me directly. The message was polite, but the concern beneath it was obvious. She wanted details about the project. She wanted projected heights. She wanted construction timelines. Most importantly, she wanted to know whether the structure would be visible from the neighborhood. I responded exactly the way I had responded throughout the entire process, with facts, public records, permit references, regulatory approvals. Everything was available through normal channels. There were no secrets, no hidden clauses, no special exceptions, just a fully compliant infrastructure project moving forward according to county regulations. Over the next several weeks, conversations throughout the community changed dramatically. The same residents who once celebrated expanded sightlines now found themselves discussing elevations, visibility studies, and property views. Some people supported the project because of its renewable energy benefits. Others disliked the idea immediately. But regardless of their opinions, everyone eventually reached the same conclusion. The installation was legal. One evening, I attended a county planning session where final construction logistics were reviewed. As engineers displayed diagrams on large screens, one image immediately captured everyone's attention. The elevation rendering showed the completed structure rising above the surrounding landscape. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even after months of planning, seeing the actual scale represented visually created a different impact. The turbine would not merely occupy the property. It would define the horizon. Driving home that night, I passed the cleared boundary where 80 walnut trees once stood. The setting sun illuminated the corridor in shades of gold and orange. Wind moved steadily across the open ground exactly as it had every day since the trees disappeared. Standing there, I could almost visualize the future structure occupying the site. Diane had spent a year trying to improve what people could see. Soon, construction would begin. And once the foundation was poured, there would be no misunderstanding what the new view looked like. Construction began at sunrise on a cool autumn morning. I heard the trucks before I saw them. The low rumble of diesel engines echoed across the property as heavy equipment rolled down the access road toward the prepared site. For months the project had existed on paper. Surveys, permits, engineering studies, approvals. Now steel, concrete, and machinery were arriving to turn those documents into reality. Standing near the equipment shed with a cup of coffee in my hand, I watched workers unload materials while the wind swept steadily across the open corridor. The same corridor that had once been protected by 80 walnut trees. The same corridor Diane had fought to expose. By mid-morning, activity across the property was impossible to ignore. Excavation equipment moved into position. Construction crews marked final measurements. Utility representatives coordinated connections. Every step followed a schedule refined over months of planning. There was nothing dramatic about the process. It was organized, methodical, and completely legal. Yet from the neighborhood, the reaction felt anything but calm. Throughout the day, cars slowed near the subdivision entrance. Residents gathered at common areas overlooking the countryside. Conversations spread rapidly. Some people brought binoculars. Others simply stood outside staring toward the construction site. Curiosity had transformed into concern. Around noon, I received several messages asking what exactly was being built. I responded politely and directed everyone toward publicly available permit documents. The answers had been there for weeks. Most people simply had not believed the project would actually happen. That evening, as workers secured equipment for the night, I noticed a familiar vehicle parked near a community overlook. Diane stood beside it speaking with several homeowners while gesturing toward my property. Even from a distance, I could tell she was frustrated. For the first time since this conflict began, she was reacting instead of directing. The following weeks brought even more visible changes. Concrete trucks arrived. Foundation work advanced. Survey stakes gave way to permanent structures. Every morning the site looked different than it had the day before. The project was no longer something residents imagined. They could physically watch it growing. What fascinated me most was how frequently people referenced the walnut trees. Homeowners who once supported their removal now talked about them with surprising appreciation. Some admitted the landscape felt different without them. Others said they missed the natural appearance they provided. A few openly wondered whether keeping the trees would have been the better choice. Those conversations continued, increasing as construction progressed. One windy afternoon, I attended a community meeting where residents discussed the project. The room felt noticeably different from previous gatherings. Questions filled the air. Could construction be stopped? Were there height restrictions? Did the HOA have authority over the project? Each answer produced the same result. No. The installation complied with county regulations. No. The permits were valid. No. The HOA had no jurisdiction over agricultural energy infrastructure on private land. As the meeting continued, I noticed something important. Nobody talked about sightlines anymore. Nobody talked about improved views. Those arguments had quietly disappeared, because everyone now understood what was coming. A few days later, the first major structural components arrived. Massive sections of equipment rested on specialized trailers parked beside the foundation site. Workers prepared for the next phase while residents watched from a distance. Standing near the cleared boundary at sunset, I looked across the open corridor where the walnut trees once stood. Wind moved steadily through the field, bending grass beneath a sky painted orange and gold. The foundation was complete. The components were here. And for the first time, the future structure felt close enough to touch. The day the main structure went up felt strangely quiet at first. Sunrise arrived beneath a pale blue sky, and for a brief moment the property looked almost unchanged. Then the cranes appeared. Their long booms stretched across the horizon like mechanical arms reaching toward the clouds. Construction crews moved with practiced precision. Every worker knew exactly where to stand, exactly what to do, exactly how the sequence would unfold. Months of planning were about to become visible in a matter of hours. I stood near the edge of the field watching the operation begin while steady wind flowed across the open corridor. The same wind that had shaped every decision leading to this moment continued moving through the landscape as if it had been waiting for the project all along. One by one, major components were lifted into position. Massive equipment that had looked manageable while resting on trailers suddenly appeared enormous once suspended above the foundation. The scale changed everything. Distances that seemed large on engineering drawings felt much larger in reality. Throughout the morning, residents gathered along observation points throughout the neighborhood. Some watched from back patios. Others stood near walking trails overlooking the property. Phones appeared everywhere. Pictures were taken. Videos were recorded. Conversations spread rapidly. By lunchtime, nearly everyone could see the transformation happening across the field. The structure had become impossible to ignore. What surprised me was not the visibility. We all knew it would be visible. What surprised me was how often people compared it to the walnut trees. Again and again I overheard similar comments. The trees had felt natural. The trees had blended into the landscape. The trees had provided privacy. Listening to those conversations, I found myself thinking about the countless meetings where those same benefits had been dismissed as obstacles. Now people were rediscovering their value through comparison. During the afternoon, another major section was secured into place. The silhouette on the horizon grew taller and more defined. Even from miles away, the project could be identified instantly. Several residents who had previously supported Diane's campaign began openly questioning how events had reached this point. The answer was simple, although few wanted to say it aloud. Actions create consequences. Remove infrastructure, and new infrastructure often replaces it. Land rarely remains empty for long. Later that evening, I received word that another HOA meeting had become unusually tense. Residents wanted explanations. Some questioned earlier decisions. Others wondered whether alternative solutions could have preserved the landscape they once enjoyed. Diane reportedly spent much of the meeting discussing future options, but there were very few options left to discuss. The permits had been approved. Construction was nearly complete. Every stage had passed inspection. The project existed because regulations allowed it to exist. As sunset approached, workers completed another phase and gradually left the site. The crane stood motionless against the evening sky while long shadows stretched across the field. I walked toward the boundary and stopped where one of the largest walnut trees had once stood. Months earlier, this location had been defined by branches, shade, and the rustling sound of leaves. Now a very different landmark occupied the horizon. Looking up, I realized the final stage was close. The structure already dominated the landscape, yet the most visible components were still waiting to be installed. Soon the project would move beyond construction. Soon it would become operational. And when that happened, the view Diane had spent so much effort creating would belong to everyone, every day, for a very long time. The final inspection took less than 2 hours. After everything that had happened, that seemed almost unbelievable. Months of engineering, permitting, construction, and review ultimately came down to a small group of inspectors walking the site with clipboards and checklists. I watched from a distance as they moved between equipment, reviewed documentation, verified specifications, and completed their procedures. The wind remained steady throughout the morning, sweeping across the open corridor exactly as it had every day since the walnut trees disappeared. Shortly after noon, the confirmation arrived. The installation was officially approved for operation. There were no dramatic celebrations, no speeches, no grand announcement, just a simple notification confirming that every requirement had been satisfied. Yet standing there beside the completed structure, I felt something far more satisfying than excitement. I felt closure. For nearly a year, the conversation had revolved around visibility, view corridors, sightlines, aesthetics. Every meeting, complaint, and proposal had centered on what people wanted to see. In the end, that single obsession had reshaped the landscape more completely than anyone expected. The first time the system entered normal operation, many residents noticed immediately. Not because of sound. Modern equipment operates remarkably quietly. They noticed because the structure had become part of the horizon. Every sunrise, every sunset, every walk through the neighborhood, every glance from a back porch. It was simply there. Permanent. Legal. Impossible to overlook. During the following weeks, community discussions gradually changed tone. The anger faded first, then the frustration. Eventually, curiosity replaced both. Some residents began asking questions about renewable energy. Others wanted to understand how agricultural zoning worked. A few admitted they had never realized private property rights extended as far as they did. Those conversations were far more productive than the arguments that had come before them. One evening, several months after completion, I attended a community gathering where residents discussed future neighborhood projects. The atmosphere felt completely different from the meetings I remembered. People listened more carefully. Assumptions were challenged more often. Property owners asked better questions before supporting proposals. Experience had become a teacher. Diane was there as well. She looked tired, older somehow, not because of time, but because certainty had finally been replaced by reality. For the first time since I had known her, she spent most of the meeting listening instead of directing. Nobody mentioned the walnut trees directly, yet their absence lingered over every discussion. Everyone understood the connection. If the trees had remained, the landscape would look very different. The open corridor would not exist. The wind resource would be less attractive. The project might never have moved forward. That was the twist nobody could escape. The outcome everyone disliked had been created by the very decision intended to prevent unwanted change. Sometimes justice does not arrive through courtrooms or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives through paperwork, patience, and consequences. On a quiet autumn evening, nearly a year after I first stepped onto my porch and discovered 80 empty stumps, I returned to the same spot. The sky glowed orange as the sun dropped below the horizon. Wind moved steadily across the property. Looking toward the boundary, I thought about everything that had happened. The trees were gone, and I still missed them. Nothing could replace what decades of growth had created. But standing there, watching the completed structure rise above the landscape, I also understood something important. Diane had spent months fighting for a better view. In the end, she got exactly what she asked for. She just never imagined what everyone would be looking at.